Good evening. Welcome. I'm Brittany, a bookseller at Literati bookstore. We're so pleased to welcome Julie Metz in support of her book, Ava and Eve, A Search for My Mother's Lost Childhood and What a War Left Behind, in conversation with Maya Shanbhag Lang. Just a quick webinar overview for our attendees. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be dropping links to purchase Ava and Eve from Literati through the event. Q&A is accessible, so please submit your questions there. Live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. If you're watching us later on YouTube, links to purchase the books are in the description. A reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this evening. And now allow me to introduce tonight's author. Julie Metz is the New York Times bestselling author of Perfection. She has written for publications including the New York Times, Salon, Dame, Tablet, Catapult, and Glamour. She has received fellowships at Yaddo, MacDowell, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts and the Vermont Studio Center. You can find out more about Julie's writing life on Instagram at Julie Metz Writer and her website, juliemetz.com. She is joined in conversation by Maya Shanbhag Lang. She is the author of What We Carry, named a New York Times Editor's Choice, a Good Morning America Mother's Day pick, and a must-read Best of 2020 memoir by Bustle, Book Riot, Parade, Times of India, and others. She is also the author of The 16th of June, longlisted for the Center of Fiction First Novel Prize, and a named must-read novel by CBS and InStyle. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and others. She holds a PhD in comparative literature, received the Neil Shepard Prize in Fiction, and is the daughter of South Asian immigrants. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful guest tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And I thought I'd begin just we'll talk a little bit about our books. My book is Ava and Eve. This is the new edition now out in paper. And this book tells the story of how my mother's family escaped from Nazi-occupied Austria in 1940, and then their lives as immigrants. And I think the topic is very relevant now as we see more waves of immigrants coming to the United States and moving around in other countries. So this is a personal investigation of my family history and also the relevance for the time that we're living in now. And I'll turn that over now to Maya, who will talk a little bit about her book, and then we'll begin our conversation.
Thanks, Julie, and thank you to Literati for hosting this and for having us. So I'm the author of What We Carry, which is a memoir about when I became my mother's caregiver. And it was not a situation that I had anticipated. She needed emergency care, and I moved her in with me on a whim. And my life changed overnight. My daughter was really young at the time, and I was suddenly in this juncture of being a fairly new mom and in the brand new position of caring for my mother. And being at that crossroads really made me rethink motherhood generally. And what I found was that I was caring for my mother, and there were certain things that were coming up that made me re-examine my childhood. So it was sort of this process of seeing things in a new light, seeing her in a new light, and also realizing that I had misperceived her for really much of my life. So What We Carry, the title comes from, the stories we carry around of ourselves and the people in our lives, and how those stories were constantly kind of up for grabs. So Julie, I thought I would start just by asking you, what led you to write this book? Was it a story that you kind of always knew you wanted to write? Was there something that catalyzed the writing process? and how did the memoir kind of come about?
Yeah, so the title of the book, Ava and Eve, refers to the fact that my mother was born in Austria, and her given name there was Ava. And then when she came to the United States, when she became a US citizen in 1947, she changed it to Eve. And although the change is very subtle, to me, it always was meaningful. What happened was that shortly after my mother died, I was going through her belongings and I came upon a pretty startling discovery. It was hidden, literally hidden in the back of a drawer, was a small keepsake book that no one in the family had ever seen, not even my father, and they had been married for 54 years. And what this keepsake book was, it's sort of like a little autograph book, I guess we would call it, where your friends or your family, maybe your teachers will sign and write a note of farewell. These were, I didn't know this at the time that I discovered it, but there are archives full of these little keepsake books. Often this was the only thing that a young child could bring with them when they left their home. And many of them are now in archives. When I found the book, it was immediately clear to me that while I had known certain things about my mother's childhood, it was clear that there was a lot I didn't know. And also it was clear that the fact that this book had remained hidden for over 5 decades, that it was really holding a lot of pain and a lot of secrecy. And so for the first time, I thought I really need to try to understand what that story really was. In a way, it's related to the title of your book, that she carried a lot and she never really had an opportunity to sort of unload all that emotional burden. And so after that, I really felt that it was time to research and find out the story of how my mother's family had come here. So I know that you talked a little bit about having to become your mother's caregiver, and both of our books, I think, really do deal with relationships of mother and daughter and how that might change over time. In my case, my relationship with my mother had been quite difficult during her life. And then I guess in your case, maybe you can speak about that, just what happened when your mother had to move in with you and how that influenced your decision to write about your experiences.
Yeah, well, what's funny, so I actually had no intention of writing this book. I really had thought of myself as a fiction writer and felt very sort of firm and stubborn about that as my identity. And when I was suddenly in this position of caring for my mother and my life just suddenly, being completely overwhelmed by the responsibilities of that, I started writing these posts on Facebook because I would have 5 minutes where I would just be needing an outlet, and it was sort of like needing to let the steam out of the pot of the pressure cooker of my life. And an editor saw these posts, some of which were getting a lot of shares, and she reached out to my agent and said oh, would Maya want to write a nonfiction book, like a series of essays? And I said, oh, I'm really flattered, but there's no way I could ever write about my own life. I'm a fiction writer. And that evening I sat down and wrote 50 pages or something. So I thought oh, I guess maybe I can write about my life. And I guess also there's stuff here that needs to be unpacked. And yeah, I think I actually had in some ways kind of the opposite experience of you, where I had always described my mother and I as really close and would sort of boast about what an amazing kind of force of nature person she was, and described her in these glowing terms. And during her dementia, as I learned things about her, I thought, wait a minute, I don't actually know you at all. And in many ways, I don't think we really were close. I think my father was just such a identifiably terrible parent, that I looked to my mother to be the good parent. And I think she could have like done anything, and I would have found a way to be like, you're the best parent ever, because I really wanted to see myself that way.
Mhm.
So it's interesting what we kind of give ourselves when we're kids.
Yeah, I think there's sort of this question about sort of the narration of our lives.
Yeah.
And I did encounter a bit of that in a different sort of way when I was doing research for my book. There were some parts of the story where there was nobody left alive who could really tell me what had happened. But my mother had shared the very few stories she would tell all sounded so improbable, so incredible, really. I thought, is my mother a reliable narrator? And so a lot of my research was about trying to confirm those stories, like, was anything she told me really founded in fact? And it was very interesting, most of it did hold up. There were a few stories where it was not completely inaccurate. It was just sort of through the lens of the child that she was in 1940 when all these things were happening. So I wonder if, I've read your book, so I know that in some ways you did discover that your mother was quite an unreliable narrator, and that maybe you could talk a little bit about how just writing the book and what happened during your time sort of opened up sort of secrets about the way that you'd grown up, and sort of a reassessment in a way of your experience as a daughter.
Yeah, well, so like, as you know, one of the things I found out was that my brother had grown up in India, which weirdly I had never known growing up. Because, you don't think to ask your sibling, like, where did you grow up? You just fill in the blanks and make assumptions. And we were not the sort of family that sat around reminiscing. So it just never came up. And I used to ask my mom questions like, oh gosh, when you first became a mom, what was that like for you? And how did you handle it? And she would be evasive and would just say these things like, I don't know, I just did. And later I realized like, oh, no wonder she never went into that part of her life, because my brother was, up until he was like 5, he was with my maternal grandparents. So yeah, part of what I realized was that she carried a lot of shame and guilt about that decision. And that really opened up a lot of compassion. It's just, I suddenly saw that like, oh, the reason she had never told me this was because she felt bad about it. And I wish I could have told her, there's nothing to feel bad about here. And had I known as a child that she had made that choice, I never would have judged her for it. And so many immigrants make similar decisions just out of necessity. And I think part of what I realized was that had she been honest, I would have saw my own choices differently when I became a new mom.
Mm-hmm. And the reason, of course, that she made that choice was that she was trying to have a career at the time.
She was, and part of it, and this has to do with the immigrant lens, which I want to ask you about as well. But when immigrants come to this country, so often they have to like redo their training. So she was already a doctor, but she had to like redo her medical residency when she came here, and that was just not possible with a 6-month-old infant. But yeah, I wanted to ask you, so first, how did you kind of reassess your relationship with your mother? And was there kind of a reframing that took place for you? And then I also want to bring in our daughters, because we both have daughters in our works. But so, yeah, so both of those, I guess.
Yeah, I think, sorry about that interruption. In both cases, I think what we have mothers who were working, and I think that's a very important thing. And this was happening at a time when, I mean, my mother had a career at a time when very few of the moms of my friends had careers. So in those days, there was no maternity leave. So my mom hired a babysitter and went back to work after 2 weeks. So this was normal for me. I grew up with that feeling of, this is what you have to do if you want to have your own life. And I knew always from when I was a very small child that work experience, that career was very, very important to my mother and her sense of identity. And I think it does relate to the immigrant experience in the fact that they came here with nothing, and work was very important. It was the way that you kind of established yourself in this country. It was the way that you felt valuable and valued and respected, was basically to work. So she started working really from the time she was 16 or 17 and never stopped until she retired. And I think that sort of drive to be productive, to find some way of feeling American, was really very much identified through her career. And so, I didn't have a mom who was, offering me milk and cookies when I came home from school. I was growing up in an apartment in New York City. And by the time I was, we had a babysitter in the afternoon. By the time we were, 10, 11, by the time I was the older child, we were the proverbial latchkey kids who came into the building by ourselves and let ourselves in and watched cartoons in the afternoon and when we were supposed to be doing our homework. But I would say that some of the most potent moments of my childhood were on school holidays when my mom, because there was no childcare, would sometimes bring me into work. And I really got to see the work, what it was like to be a woman in the world working. And that was, that actually I think was, made a big impression on me and really sort of, I was always very proud that she had this job. I didn't really, without even understanding the job, I just knew that it was something that was important, and that there, in a way, that there was a kind of legacy to the work, which is that my grandfather had run a printing factory back in Vienna. And so my mom, who worked in publishing, in a way, this was sort of a continuation. And she often talked about that factory in very nostalgic terms, that what they had left behind. So I think, in your case too, I can imagine that your mom was a doctor at a time, it's still not that common, to have, I would say, a working mom at that professional level. So how did you feel about that when you were growing up?
Well, one thing that's so interesting, my mother used to laugh and say that it was funny to her that on like the evening news, on the nightly news with like Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather, they would refer to India as the third world. And she would say, first of all, she would say India has had a woman prime minister. And second of all, she would say, like, back in India, I was surrounded by like cousins and other women who were surgeons and engineers. And she said, coming to this country, she said she was the only woman in her residency program here. And when I started elementary school, she never attended a single parent-teacher meeting because she was always just like, I don't have time for these things. Yeah. And so for her, I think there was this kind of shock of being the only, not the only, but one of very few, working outside of the house women with like very demanding careers, and she'd be on call, and she sort of expected there to be more peers for her in this country. So that was interesting. And yeah, it's funny that you mentioned those experiences of going to work with your mom on school holidays and the impression that they made on you. For me as well, it was so interesting to see that environment and to just absorb it. And it was quite formative. There was something about it where it kind of landed in a certain part of my brain where I thought, oh, like, this is my mom's space, and it's not the domestic space. And it's a space where she has a separate identity.
Yeah, sometimes even my mom would bring work home. And I remember that, like, she would do, if there was extra work to do, she would bring it home and do it on the dining table. So from a very young age, even I actually saw the work, what she was doing. And, I did it guide me in my choice of life direction, perhaps? But I think it was more that I just was impressed that she, I understood that she was juggling a lot of things. I mean, this was the period of time, they still use that word juggling, for, the mom is sort of like, you're trying to, be the best mom and have a job and, sort of make it all happen and not drop the balls and that are in the air. And I was aware even then as a small child that my mom was doing all those things, and definitely maybe more than her share in the domestic sphere. My mom was cooking and did shopping, and but there was something, she was a very organized person. I imagine your mom must have been too, in a way. I mean, just that kind, or not. But my mom was very much like that. Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, my mother was completely scattered and could not find a thing in the house. She did do all the like cooking and shopping, but she was not organized. So I think she made her own life. I think her life would have been easier had she had a more sort of organized approach to things. But
people didn't, for, essentially to be raised to find caregiving so that you could carve out a world of your own. I mean, this was the dilemma of women, when I was a kid. And to be honest, by the time I had a kid, it was still the challenge. It was still, how are we going to do this? By then I was a freelance designer and writer, and we're still trying to figure this all out. And I think it's in a way, what I took away from reading your book, one of the things I took away was just that, in a way, when you think about why she sent your brother away, it was like, what other choice really would she have had at that time? So it's I think that's just something that we're still grappling, women are still grappling with, for sure.
I think in some ways it's actually become harder now.
How would you say?
Just in the sense that I think we have more guilt now. I think back then, if, to take your kids to the office for the day, or to kind of just like do whatever you needed to do, I think there was a lot less expectation of perfection, to invoke your first book. And now there's so much guilt and such a feeling, I think largely because of social media, there's this feeling of like needing to get it right. And you're not just supposed to figure out the juggling act, but you're supposed to like look good while juggling and juggle gracefully and like, do yoga while juggling, and all these expectations. And I think back then it was like, oh, you don't even have a car seat in the station wagon. And
that's for sure. I think it's that is true. I do remember that when my own daughter was young, I was sort of crushed with guilt, like the moments I missed because I had a career and because I was working. I didn't see my daughter's first steps because they were out with the babysitter. And so it was, I missed a lot of things and felt very crushed about it. But then I always had to remind myself that, this was the legacy that my mother had left me, was that work was important and that you needed that to sort of help define who you were, in addition to being a parent, that it wasn't that you really would want that, and that would become more valuable, especially as your kids get older and then they go to school and then they have their own lives too. So
Yeah.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit though, because your situation with your mom, you end up becoming your mother's caregiver and you're really watching her slip almost back into a kind of childlike state. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
I think one thing is that so often people assume that that time must have been really negative. And in many ways, not to downplay the fact that I was exhausted and fried and that it was a 24/7 job to prepare her food and get her into the shower and get her dressed and all that stuff. At the same time, there was this interesting window that I got into her because her armor fell away and she was suddenly able to talk about her life in ways that she had never done before, with a kind of childlike honesty and vulnerability, because she felt no need to cover over that stuff or put up a veneer. And hearing her made me realize, like, I'd always viewed her as this person who had life completely figured out and had all the answers and had like a master plan. And it dawned on me that like she had no idea what she was doing and she figured out so much of it on the fly. And then later presented it to me as like, oh, she didn't, up until her dementia, she had never disclosed those parts of her life where her whole trajectory could have turned out completely differently.
It's so fascinating because I think, that kind of reversal that happens when a parent gets dementia and then becomes needy, like a child of care. I certainly know I have friends who are in that situation that you're in now. And I imagine you do too, where you really see, how our generation really is caught between the caregiving role, but on both sides. I think it's a challenge that maybe people in a different generation didn't have to face in quite the same way. I think I'm sure I was curious if we could talk a bit about just that, what happens when you move to a different country, you've left everything behind, all your cultural reference points are gone, and you have to sort of remake life, but no one's given you a handbook, you're just dropped. Maybe now there's some support, I'm not sure, but at least there's some bilingual effort in schools. My mother described coming to the United States at the age of 12 and a half, being put into a public school. She could not speak, barely 2 words of English. And there was no effort made to help her acclimate. It was just learn English, honey, because and that's what she did. And it's, I think the sense of loss really never left, because in a way none of that had ever been resolved. So again,
I was dying to ask you about this, because both of our books are stories of kind of the legacy and inheritance of immigration. And I don't think enough really gets said about what happens when you come to this country and have to it's a sink or swim survival mindset, and what that does for the next generation in terms of how it kind of frames a fundamental approach to life, which I think is one that where it's like pragmatism and necessity, those are the things that like govern our choices. So I was curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for my mom, it was, especially given what was happening in her home country, that basically you were running for your life, literally. The people who got out were incredibly fortunate. I think it was a situation of such intense terror and danger that you never, it's hard to get over that. And even then, when you get to a country where, you are reasonably safe, I would say, reasonably safe, especially in New York City, which is where they came. There were many, many Jewish immigrants coming from all points of Europe at that time. There's always a sense that the sky is going to fall any day. So very practical, no fanciful, kind of ideas about life. It was work, it was family, it was planning for the future, lots of planning. So, there was no, I think you lose then a sense of spontaneity about life. And I didn't really experience that until I was on my own in my early 20s and went traveling for the first time alone. And this was, pre-internet and pre-cell phone. And suddenly there I was, just wandering around in Europe, for, a couple summers I did it. My parents had no idea where I was. And it was really the first time I ever understood that feeling of freedom from, kind of the burden of being in a family where there were expectations about how to live. And so I think that does get handed down, and then it's really the dilemma of the next generations to kind of sort through that. Have you had a similar experience then?
Yeah, completely. And so I'm curious, one thing I've sort of realized is that I still, even at the age of, I'm 43 now, and despite having written this book and despite having thought about this topic of like having very risk averse parents who thought life needed to be guided by necessity, I still at times have moments where I feel like, oh, there's a certain thing I should do. And if I dare to like do something for fun, that like I'll get arrested or that, and it's quite ridiculous. Like, so it came up for me the other day, as you know, I'm single.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about going on a date with someone. And I was saying to a friend, like, yeah, truthfully, I don't really think things would work out between us long term, but he's handsome and fun. And I think it'd be like fun to have dinner with him. And she looked at me and she was like, well, then why wouldn't you have dinner with him? And I said, well, it just feels wrong because it's not like the practical thing. And she was like, Maya, you deserve to have like a fun dinner that's allowed. Like you're not going to get in trouble. So I was curious if that like still kind of comes up for you.
Definitely. I mean, I think it was such a presence. Certainly a lot of the people who were emigres from the post-war period, I think their children would say the same thing, that there was kind of this kind of doomsday attitude where, you're always preparing for the bad thing that might happen, even though you've arrived here. And of course, when my mother arrived in the United States in 1940, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. My father, who grew up in the United States and was Jewish and grew up in Philadelphia and then fought in the Second World War, talked about anti-Semitism in the army, just being blatantly called slurs, which I will not mention in this company. But so I think when they arrived in New York, they moved to a neighborhood that was certainly a very Jewish neighborhood and where you could feel comfortable. But of course, the minute you leave the safe enclave that you've chosen, wherever that might be, I think then you start to experience that kind of fear again. And I know this, my partners from Wausau, Wisconsin, and there's actually a very large Hmong community that settled there. And then also in the town where I live, there's a very large Bangladeshi community. And you can see sort of the same thing. There's a kind of insularity there where the families really stay tight with each other. And, you know, there's kind of the traditions are being maintained. At the same time, of course, the next generation, they're growing up as Americans. They go to American schools. They, you know, they're kind of like, I don't know if I want arranged marriages and this and that, right? And so you really see the conflict in the next generation. I feel like for me, a lot of the difficulties that I had with my mom had to do with this very fact that she had been so close to her parents because they were escaping a war and they had to stick together to survive. And then, you know, I'm growing up and I'm having an American adolescence where, you know, you want to put as much distance between yourself and your parents as you can and do bad things that you're not supposed to be doing, you know. So I think that I'm imagining this might be a common thread in a lot of immigrant communities where you have the next generation just wants to be American, you know, whatever that can mean, you know. Yeah. It's a fluid, kind of a fluid idea, but it's, do you find that you had that same experience, that your mom had sort of expectations around, you know, how you should live, and then, you know, you're trying to, as a teenager, sort of break off from that?
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting is that, so I didn't grow up in like an Indian community. We were the only Indian family, but in our Long Island suburb. But, you know, my parents never said to me, like, you really need to excel at school. Or they never said to me, like, you shouldn't become a writer. These things were never like explicitly expressed, but I felt such a deep, I think sometimes it's the stuff that doesn't get talked about that you just kind of osmotically like absorb that can be the most either damaging or just the most shaping on you, or the most influential. So yeah, and like, you know, as you were talking, part of what I was thinking about was like, in my case, the sort of survival mindset of my parents doesn't really make sense. I mean, it makes a lot more sense in your case of people literally fleeing, you know, mass genocide and these horrific, you know, where you really are escaping for survival purposes. Mm-hmm. And I think in my parents' case, a lot of their phobias and anxieties were this kind of irrational, you know, I think it came from more of an emotional place of feeling like they were in this strange country without support. And so they just didn't really want to stray from like the house or from certain things that felt safe. Kind of like when you go on vacation to a strange place and you only like will wander 2 or 3 blocks because you know those 2 or 3 blocks. That was sort of their existential approach for decades.
I mean, ironically, I had a bit of that experience when I was doing research for my book, because I was going to Austria. And in fact, my mother, of course, German was her first language, but for emotional reasons, I believe, she never taught us to speak German. I do regret that, but I wish I could speak it. But when I had to go and do research, I had to rely on other people to do translation for me. I can pick up a few words here and there, but there's no way that I can really understand what's around me. And it really was when you first get to a country where you cannot speak the language and you know that it's a Western country, but every culture is very unique. And you immediately have that feeling of just being in some strange land, and you feel very different. You feel very different and isolated. And that's the times that I've thought, this must have been what it was like when my mom arrived in New York, and you can't speak the language. You don't know what's going on around you. the even sort of basic cultural things,
Yeah.
how offices work, how the bureaucracy in a country works, everything's different. And
Yeah.
that takes, you know, that could take you many years to kind of adjust to. And I don't think her parents, for example, her parents learned English, but it was never a perfect situation. And I think for them, you know, they relied on their daughter to help them interpret the world that they had arrived in. And that's something when I've talked to other people, children of first generation immigrants,
Yeah.
that's a very common thread, is that the child is sort of goes out into the world, and the parents are sort of trying to, you know, just kind of, you know, hold on to something that is familiar. And I think that was the case with my grandparents, whom I never met, but they did their best. I think they really tried, but they were not young when they arrived. You know,
Yeah.
my grandfather was in his 60s, and my grandmother was younger, but still, you know, it was very, needless to say, New York City is nothing like Vienna that they had left. Vienna is a very kind of calm and elegant and peaceful city by comparison. I can only imagine that when the ship pulled into New York Harbor and you're looking up at skyscrapers, you would just think you had landed on another planet.
Right.
So yeah, and I think about that. I think about that a lot.
One thing I think your memoir does so beautifully is the way it incorporates research into the fabric of the story. And I was curious what that process, and I should say, like, in a way that doesn't feel heavy-handed or like research is, you know. So I was curious what that process was like for you, and if there was kind of a balancing act of how much to include and when to include it.
Yeah, that's an interesting, you know, I started out when maybe a bit like you, when I started out poking around, let's say, into the family history, I didn't think I was writing a book. I thought I was just, you know, trying to uncover a bit about my family story. When I started doing the research, I realized I needed help. And I did reach out to an institute that's based in New York City. And one of the archivists, historians there really was invaluable and sort of steered me in lots of directions, helped me find translators when I needed documents translated. I would say for me, the research, I really discovered that I really enjoy doing the research. And there were times when I felt like I had to forcibly pull myself back from it and say, okay, we've done enough for now. Now we have to write pages, because if, you know, you could spend your life continuing to investigate something that might or might not serve your book. And in the beginning, I didn't even know what I was looking for. So some of it I had to stumble upon. I would say some of the most important research was going there, was actually putting my feet on the ground in the city where my mother had grown up and really experiencing it and really trying to sort of, like, to the best that I could, you know, it's always difficult, you know, to put yourself in someone else's shoes, but really to walk the neighborhood, to try to imagine what their lives were like. In some ways, an old European city visually, there's not much different. In fact, where my grandfather's printing factory is, the building is still there. Another business is in the space. And one of his clients, another pharmacy that they made packaging for, is still there in the same location 4 blocks away. So, you know, European cities, that's sort of a beautiful thing, that you can find yourself in the same streets looking at the same buildings. And that was very important as a sort of, when I write a memoir, I really want the writer to have a sensory experience of place. And I want them to have the experience that I had So I want them to smell and see and experience all that. So that's really, for me, the most important part of the research was being able to do that.
For the record, I still remember, so, I read your book when it came out, it's the hardcover, and I still remember those scenes which felt so vivid. I remember feeling like, oh, I've been transported to, old European sort of cobblestone streets, and I felt like I was there in a very distinct and vivid way.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, because that's really what, I think maybe you could talk about your own writing process in that regard, but writing memoir really is about inviting people into your life,
right,
and sort of figuring out how to make your very particular experience, to give it some universality that will be meaningful to other people. For example, our books are about mothers, and not every reader is certainly not going to have an identical experience, but there is something, you're trying to create that universal feeling. So maybe you could talk a bit about how that worked for you when you were writing.
Well, it was so funny. So when I was writing, I didn't have time to write. So for the draft process, I would often just take 20 minutes and hide in the hall closet, which was kind of a larger closet, because I found it was the one place where I could go and no one would look for me. If I went to the bathroom, if you have a young child and a dementia patient in your home, they will find you. So I remember feeling quite self-conscious about my writing process at the time, because it felt, it didn't feel legitimate, and it didn't feel like this is how a book should get written. It felt very fractured and sort of vignette based. And I thought oh, this is a problem. And later I'm going to have to build narrative. And then during the revision process, I thought, well, I wrote it in these short bits because I was in crisis and because I could only kind of process the story in little bits. And I thought, well, what if I were to deliver it to the reader that way? And maybe they need kind of breaks as much as I needed them. So the writing process made me rethink just at kind of the craft level, negative space on the page, and the idea of kind of having really short chapters and that being okay. That was a big break for me, because my first book was a novel and it was these long fluid passages. So that was eye-opening for me.
Yeah, I think each book has its own kind of problems to solve. And the new project that I'm beginning work on, you think, oh, I've published 2 books, I should have a roadmap. But then what you find, and I don't know if you're finding the same, is that every book has its own challenges and sort of functional problems to solve. And every experience of writing is going to feel very new again, and not anything like the last. So that's kind of where I'm at now. Yeah.
Brittany, you're back with us.
I am. I would like to thank you both so much for coming and speaking with us tonight and giving us such an engaging and thoughtful conversation. And I for sure am looking forward to buying your books and reading them. And thank you to all of us joining us at home with Literati tonight. And thanks to our viewers. And make sure to buy the book. The link is in the chat and then on the event listing that brought you here. And those of you on YouTube, it's going to be below the video. And of course, come into our store, and thank you for your support. We'll see you at the next event.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.